My name is Sophia. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been described with words like steady, low maintenance, and the responsible one. I work in a role that rewards planning and patience, and I've always been the kind of person people trust with logistics, money, and the unglamorous details others don't want to touch. From the outside, I look calm, almost unbothered. Some people mistake calm for softness, others mistake it for agreement. This story isn't about a dramatic villain or a shocking betrayal caught on camera. It's about something quieter, slower, harder to explain in a headline. I paid for our wedding alone. He called it our sacrifice. And the red flags were there before the vows. I just chose not to see them. I'm telling this story not to humiliate anyone, not to win sympathy, and not to rewrite myself as a hero. I'm telling it because there's a kind of emotional injustice that doesn't leave bruises or screenshots. It lives in tone, in assumptions, in who is expected to give, and who is allowed to forget. For years, people assumed I was lucky. Lucky to have a partner, lucky that things were easy, lucky that I didn't complain. What they didn't see was how often my silence was interpreted as consent, and how often my reliability became a resource others felt entitled to manage. This is a story about how that happens, slowly, how small dismissals get normalized, how responsibility quietly shifts hands without a conversation, how love can coexist with imbalance, at least for a while. There is no screaming confrontation here, no revenge plot, no moment where I slam a door and walk away to applause. What does happen is subtler: awareness, documentation, restraint, and a decision made without theatrics. A kind of quiet dominance that doesn't announce itself until it's already irreversible. Over the next chapters, I'll take you through who I was in that relationship, how I was perceived, and how I allowed myself to be framed as the strong one while absorbing costs, emotional and financial, that were never truly shared. I'll talk about the moment something shifted inside me, long before anything changed on the outside. And I'll show you what it looks like when silence stops being a wound and becomes a choice. I'm not proud of every decision I made. I'm not ashamed of them either. This is an honest account, told with distance and clarity, not heat. If you've ever looked back at your own life and realized you explained away things you would now name differently, you may recognize yourself somewhere in the story. Before we go any further, I want to ask you, gently, have you ever stayed quiet, not because you didn't feel the weight, but because you didn't yet have the language to name it? Before I tell you what went wrong, I need you to understand who I was to them. To my partner, to his family, to our friends, and eventually, to the version of myself I was slowly negotiating with. I was the capable one, not the exciting one, not the emotional center of the room. The capable one. The woman you assign tasks to because she'll handle it. The woman you don't check in on because she seems fine. The woman whose competence becomes background noise. In group settings, I was rarely introduced with enthusiasm. It was usually something practical. This is Sophia, she's really organized. Or, she's the reason this whole thing runs on time. People laughed when they said it warmly, no malice, just an assumption. I smiled back because I didn't know what else to do with that role except wear it well. My partner leaned into that narrative effortlessly. When we were dating, he admired my stability. When we were engaged, he relied on it. Somewhere along the way, admiration quietly turned into expectation. And expectation hardened into entitlement without ever announcing itself. If something needed planning, I planned it. If something needed paying for, I covered it for now. If something needed smoothing over, I did the smoothing. No one forced me. That part matters. I volunteered because volunteering felt like love. When decisions came up, people looked at me last, not because my opinion didn't matter, but because they assumed it was flexible. I was the one who could adjust, the one who didn't need convincing, the one who wouldn't take it personally if plans changed or promises softened at the edges. And I reinforced that perception. Every time I said, "It's fine," when it wasn't. Every time I said, "I don't mind," when I did. Every time I told myself that being easy was the same as being valued. What's important here is this: I wasn't invisible in the obvious way. People saw me, they trusted me, they praised me even, but they didn't protect me. And they didn't consider that strength has limits when it's never reciprocated. My partner often described us as a team. He liked that word. It sounded equal, collaborative. What he meant, though, was that I was the infrastructure, the thing that holds weight without being acknowledged unless it fails. I became the person whose needs were postponed because they were never urgent. The person whose discomfort was theoretical, not actionable. The person who didn't raise alarms, so none were installed. I didn't feel oppressed. That word came much later, if at all. What I felt was something quieter, a gradual shrinking of what I allowed myself to expect. I told myself I didn't need grand gestures. That fairness was less important than harmony. That love wasn't transactional, even as the ledger kept growing. When we got engaged, friends joked that I was basically planning the whole thing already. They weren't wrong. I nodded along, unaware that this pattern was about to scale up in ways I hadn't prepared for. I want to be very clear. There was no single moment where someone declared, "You will carry this." It happened because I was good at carrying things, and because I didn't yet believe that being capable also entitled me to be considered. This is how invisibility actually works most of the time. Not through neglect, but through reliance. Not through cruelty, but through comfort. I was useful. And usefulness, when left unquestioned, can quietly replace partnership. At that stage, I still believed that if I stayed patient, things would naturally rebalance. That once the stress passed, once the milestone was reached, once we were settled, the weight would distribute itself more fairly. I didn't yet understand that patterns don't correct themselves. They entrench. And the role I was playing, reliable, adaptable, silent, was already being mistaken for who I was. The first small cut didn't arrive with drama. It didn't announce itself as a warning. It showed up dressed as practicality, almost reasonable if you didn't look too closely. It happened during an early conversation about the wedding. Not the venue, not the guest list. Money. We were sitting at the kitchen table, laptops open, spreadsheets half-built. I had already started running numbers because that's how my mind works. I like clarity before emotions enter the room. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching me scroll. At one point, he laughed lightly and said, "You're so good at this stuff. I'd be lost without you." It sounded like a compliment. Everyone would have heard it that way. Then he added casually, "Why don't you just handle the main costs, and I'll contribute where I can? It's kind of our sacrifice anyway." That was the cut. Not the words themselves, but the framing. Just handle it, where I can, our sacrifice. No discussion of percentages, no timeline, no acknowledgement that handling it meant assuming risk, not just writing checks. I paused. I remember that pause clearly because it was the first time something in me hesitated, and then moved on without resolution. I asked a clarifying question lightly. "So, what does where you can look like?" He shrugged, not defensively, comfortably. "We'll figure it out. You know I'm good for it." And that was that. To anyone listening in, it sounded like trust, like a partnership, like optimism. No one would have flagged it as disrespect. Not my friends, not his family, probably not even me if I'm honest. But my body registered it before my mind did. There was a subtle shift in temperature, a feeling that something had been decided about me rather than with me. I remember telling myself all the reasonable things afterward. It's temporary, he's under pressure, marriage isn't about keeping score. I even felt a quiet pride, an unspoken sense that I was strong enough to carry this without making it a problem, that I was being mature, forward-thinking, supportive. That pride would cost me more than I realized. From that moment on, the language around money changed. Not dramatically, just enough. It became something I had under control, something I was better at, something that didn't need revisiting because I hadn't objected the first time. When friends asked how we were splitting things, he'd smile and say, "We're flexible. Sophia's got the details." They laughed. I smiled. No one questioned it. What stayed with me wasn't resentment. It was a note I filed away. A quiet internal record that said, "Pay attention." Because here's what I understood, even then. If this were truly our sacrifice, the weight would have been discussed, not assumed. I didn't confront him. I didn't correct the narrative. I adjusted. I recalculated. I absorbed. And in doing so, I taught everyone, including him, something dangerous, that I would close the gap without asking who created it. The first small cut is never the one that bleeds. It's the one that tests whether you'll notice, whether you'll name it, whether you'll require repair. I noticed it. I just wasn't ready to name it yet. So I let it pass. And because I let it pass, it didn't stay small for long. After the first small cut, nothing collapsed. There was no argument, no tension that lingered in the air. That was part of what made it so easy to dismiss. Life continued. Plans moved forward. The wedding date stayed on the calendar. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, The imbalance began to feel normal. Once a pattern doesn't meet resistance, it starts to repeat itself. Not aggressively, but efficiently. The language stayed the same. The assumptions stayed the same. I stayed the same. Whenever a new expense appeared, eyes drifted toward me. Not intentionally, instinctively. I was the one who knew how to make it work. The one who could figure something out. The one who didn't panic when numbers got uncomfortable. At first, he'd still ask, "Do you think we can cover this? Is this doable?" But those questions were more ceremonial than collaborative. By the time he asked, the expectation was already formed. If I hesitated, he'd follow up with reassurance instead of adjustment. "It's only money. We'll recover. It'll be worth it." Worth it for whom? That question floated in the back of my mind, unanswered. I didn't ask it out loud because I didn't want to sound transactional. I didn't want to reduce our relationship to math. I didn't want to be the person who made things about money. So I made things about endurance instead. I told myself this was just how partnerships worked. One person leans while the other holds. I told myself my turn to lean would come later. After the wedding, after the stress, after the big life moment that supposedly justifies a temporary imbalance. The problem with later is that it keeps moving. Every time I adapted without protest, the baseline shifted. What once would have required a conversation became default. What once would have been shared became absorbed. Not because anyone demanded it, but because I demonstrated I could. Friends praised us for being low drama. Family members commented on how chill I was. Even he seemed grateful, just not in ways that redistributed the load. Gratitude, I learned, doesn't automatically translate into fairness. There were moments when I almost spoke up. Small windows of opportunity where I could have said, "This doesn't feel balanced," or "I need us to revisit how we're handling this." Each time I closed the window myself. I didn't want to rock the boat. I didn't want to introduce tension into something that was supposed to be joyful. I didn't want to risk being seen as difficult. And beneath all of that was a quieter fear. If I stopped being easy, would I still be loved? So I normalized what shouldn't have been normal. I reframed discomfort as generosity. I turned silence into virtue. I convinced myself that being the strong one meant not needing things explained, acknowledged, or reciprocated in real time. What I didn't realize then was that silence doesn't freeze dynamics, it trains them. He began to speak about our finances in general terms. "We're okay, we'll manage," without ever re-entering the specifics. I became the keeper of numbers and the absorber of consequences. When something went wrong, I fixed it. When something went right, it was us. That asymmetry didn't feel like betrayal, it felt like erosion. And erosion is easy to ignore because it happens, while everything still stands. By the time I noticed how tired I was, I'd already justified the tiredness as temporary. By the time I noticed how little room there was for my hesitation, I'd already trained myself not to hesitate. I wasn't being mistreated in a way that would alarm anyone else. I was being slowly displaced, from partner to support system. And the most uncomfortable truth of that period is this. I participated in my own minimization because it felt safer than confronting what it might mean if I didn't. Normalizing disrespect doesn't require cruelty. It only requires consistency, and a person willing to stay quiet long enough for the imbalance to feel like peace. By the time I understood there was a role I was playing, everyone else already knew it by heart. I was the reliable one, the one you don't check on, the one you assume will adapt. It wasn't written anywhere. No one sat me down and explained it. But it showed up in small, consistent ways. How decisions were made, how responsibilities were distributed, how my needs were treated as optional while my contributions were treated as guaranteed. When conversations turned logistical, people looked at me. When they turned emotional, they looked elsewhere. I had become the structure, not the center. The adult in the room, even when the room was full of adults. My partner didn't see himself as unfair. That's important. He saw himself as optimistic, flexible, easygoing. He believed that things would work out because historically, they always had. What he didn't see was that I was the mechanism by which they worked out. I noticed it in how plans were announced to me instead of being discussed. I told them we could host. I assumed the state was fine. "You're okay with that, right?" The question came after the decision, not before. And because I was almost always okay, the sequence never changed. There was a moment, small, almost forgettable, when this crystallized for me. We were talking about a last-minute wedding expense. I mentioned that it would stretch things more than I was comfortable with. He paused, surprised, not angry, confused. "But you always make it work," he said. "Not we, you." That sentence landed heavier than it should have, because it revealed something I hadn't wanted to admit. My reliability had stopped being a trait and become an assignment. I was expected to absorb strain quietly, to smooth over gaps, to be grateful for appreciation instead of equity. And I had been rewarded for it, socially, emotionally. People praised my maturity, my composure, my lack of neediness. No one asked whether that composure was chosen or required. Once I saw the role, I started noticing how little room there was for me outside of it. If I hesitated, it disrupted the rhythm. If I expressed discomfort, it was treated as a temporary glitch, not a signal. The role wasn't cruel, but it was rigid. Reliable people don't get rescued. Useful people don't get asked what they need. Invisible labor doesn't get renegotiated unless it stops. And I wasn't stopping, not yet. There's a particular loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who trust you completely, but don't really see you. Not because they don't care, but because the system they've grown comfortable with depends on your silence. I didn't feel angry. I felt clarified. Because roles, once named, lose some of their power. I realized then that if nothing changed, this would not correct itself with time or commitment. Marriage wouldn't rebalance it. Love wouldn't automatically translate into awareness. The role would simply become permanent. And permanence without consent is a form of loss. I didn't confront him. I didn't announce my realization. I did something quieter. I started paying attention, not to what people said, but to what they assumed. And once you see assumptions clearly, you can decide whether to keep fulfilling them. The day something shifted didn't look like a turning point. There was no argument, no raised voices, no dramatic realization that split my life into before and after. If you had been there, you would have missed it completely. That's because the shift didn't happen between us. It happened inside me. I was alone when it happened. Sitting in my car, parked outside the grocery store, engine off, hands still on the steering wheel. I had just checked my bank account after transferring money for another wedding expense, one that had been added casually without discussion. The numbers were still fine. That wasn't the issue. What stopped me was something simpler and heavier. I realized I hadn't been asked. Not this time. Not any time recently. Somewhere along the way, my consent had been replaced by assumptions so seamlessly that even I had stopped noticing when it disappeared. I sat there longer than necessary, watching people walk in and out of the store, carrying bags, laughing, living ordinary lives. And for the first time, I allowed myself to ask a question I'd been avoiding. If I stopped compensating, what would actually happen? Not hypothetically, not emotionally, practically. That question didn't come from anger, it came from clarity. I thought back through the last few months, every moment I'd adjusted, covered, reassured. Every time I'd been praised for being easy. Every time my hesitation had been smoothed over by someone else's confidence that I would handle it. And suddenly the narrative shifted. I wasn't being supported through a stressful season. I was subsidizing a system that relied on my silence. That realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel calm. Calm in a way that doesn't ask for permission. I didn't cry. I didn't spiral. I didn't rehearse a speech. I went into the grocery store, bought what I needed, and went home. But something had changed permanently. I stopped telling myself stories that softened reality. I stopped interpreting intent where impact was already clear. I stopped waiting for someone else to notice what I hadn't named. That night, my partner talked excitedly about wedding plans, about how everything was coming together. I listened. I nodded. I asked neutral questions. He didn't notice anything different, but I did, because I wasn't listening as the person responsible for making things work anymore. I was listening as someone gathering information. There's a particular moment when patience ends, not loudly, but decisively. When you realize that staying silent isn't protecting the relationship, it's protecting the imbalance. That was the moment. I didn't decide to leave. I didn't decide to confront. I decided to observe, without self-betrayal. From that day forward, my silence changed texture. It was no longer the silence of endurance. It was the silence of choice. I began to notice how often things were framed as shared when the cost was individual, how often appreciation replaced accountability, how rarely my comfort entered the equation unless I forced it there. And instead of reacting, I documented, mentally at first, then more concretely. I wasn't angry, I wasn't plotting, I was recalibrating. Because once you see clearly, you don't need to rush. You just need to stop lying to yourself. That was the day something shifted. No one else marked it, but it marked everything that came after. After that day, my silence didn't disappear. If anything, it became more noticeable, because it was no longer reactive. It was deliberate. On the surface, nothing changed. I still showed up. I still nodded through conversations. I still handled what I'd already committed to. To everyone else, I looked exactly the same. Calm, capable, unbothered. That's what made the shift invisible. What changed was the reason I stayed quiet. Before, my silence came from hope, from the belief that things would naturally rebalance if I stayed patient long enough. Now my patents came from clarity, from understanding that speaking without leverage would only reinforce the role I was trying to step out of. I began listening differently, not for reassurance, but for patterns. When he said, "We'll figure it out," I noted who we actually were in practice. When he said, "You're just better at this," I noted how often that phrase replaced responsibility. When he said, "It's only temporary," I noted how long temporary had already lasted. I stopped correcting narratives that benefited others at my expense. I stopped filling in gaps before anyone noticed they were there. I let small inconveniences surface instead of absorbing them preemptively. Not dramatically, just enough. People read that restraint as weakness. They assumed I was tired, overwhelmed, still accommodating. No one suspected a strategy because strategy requires intent. And they didn't believe I had any reason to withhold. That underestimation gave me space. I began separating what I could do from what I should do. I still paid attention to the details, but I stopped volunteering solutions that required my personal cost, unless explicitly discussed. When questions came, I answered them literally. When assumptions were made, I didn't rush to confirm them. When expectations went unspoken, I left them that way. The absence of my usual smoothing unsettled things slightly, but not enough for anyone to confront it. Discomfort hovered at the edges, unaddressed, because no one could quite name it, and I didn't help them name it. Silence, I learned, can be a mirror. When you stop managing other people's comfort, they begin to see the shape of their own expectations more clearly. I wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson. I was reclaiming my internal alignment. There's a difference. At night, I started writing things down. Not emotionally, not dramatically, just facts. Dates, numbers, who said what, who assumed what was framed as shared and what wasn't. Not to weaponize later, but to ground myself in reality. Because gaslighting doesn't always come from others. Sometimes it comes from the stories we tell ourselves to stay comfortable. My partner continued to talk about us with confidence. He seemed relaxed, even pleased. From his perspective, nothing was wrong. The system was functioning exactly as it always had. That was the problem. I noticed how easily my quiet was interpreted as consent, even now. How quickly people reverted to expecting me to adapt. It confirmed something important. If I wanted change, it wouldn't come from being more patient or more understanding. It would come from not compensating anymore. But I wasn't ready to stop everything yet. Not publicly, not abruptly. Quiet dominance doesn't announce itself. It positions itself. So I stayed calm, I stayed observant, I stayed quiet. And in that quiet, I began to prepare, not emotionally, but structurally. Because silence, when chosen, is no longer submission. It's a pause before movement. What they never noticed wasn't a secret action or a dramatic withdrawal. It was the way my attention shifted from maintaining to understanding. Once I stopped trying to hold everything together emotionally, I had more bandwidth than I realized. And I used it carefully. I began by learning, not in a frantic way, not late at night with panic. I learned the way you do when you're calm enough to see clearly. I reviewed every financial decision we'd made so far, not to assign blame, but to understand patterns. Who initiated expenses? Who benefited? Who absorbed the risk when things went slightly off plan? The answer was consistent. I started documenting, not obsessively, not emotionally, just quietly, notes in my planner, copies of statements, a clear record of what was being framed as shared versus what was actually funded by me. This wasn't preparation for revenge. It was preparation for honesty with myself first. Because there's something destabilizing about realizing you've been carrying more than you acknowledged. Documentation gives shape to what intuition already knows. I also began positioning, again subtly. I separated accounts that had slowly blurred. I adjusted how automatic transfers were handled. I made sure my name and only my name was attached to what I was paying for directly. Nothing confrontational, nothing that required explanation, just clean lines. At the same time, I paid attention to language. Who spoke with authority about our plans? Who deferred? Who assumed continuation without confirmation? No one noticed because nothing broke. The wedding planning continued. Life continued. I continued showing up exactly as expected. But I stopped overfunctioning. That's the part people rarely notice, the difference between showing up and compensating. When minor issues arose, I let them be discussed instead of quietly resolved. When questions came up, I redirected them back to the person who had made the assumption, not defensively, neutrally. "Oh, I thought you were handling that. I assumed you had a plan for it. I haven't decided yet." Those sentences changed more than any confrontation would have. I also started paying attention to how quickly discomfort spread when I didn't fill the silence. How often others stepped in once they realized I wasn't smoothing the edges anymore. It was uncomfortable, but revealing. What I was learning wasn't just about him, it was about the entire ecosystem around us. About how roles persist because someone keeps performing them. I wasn't angry at myself for having played that role. I understood why I had. It had kept things stable. It had kept me loved. It had kept conflict away. But stability without equity is just delayed reckoning. There were nights I looked at my notes and felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that I wasn't imagining things. Sadness that clarity had taken so long. Still, I didn't rush him. Quiet dominance isn't about speed, it's about timing. I waited until my understanding felt complete, until there were no emotional loose ends that could pull me back into rationalization, until my choices felt grounded, not reactive. They never noticed the shift because they didn't believe I would ever stop being the safety net. They didn't imagine a version of me that withheld without drama. That underestimation was not something I created, but it was something I could use. The private reveal didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom, each detail becoming sharper only after I'd sat with it long enough. By this point, I wasn't looking for proof anymore. I already knew. What I was looking for was definition. Because intuition can be dismissed, patterns can be explained away, but definition changes what you're allowed to deny. It started with something almost boring. One evening, after another long day of wedding-related logistics, I sat down with my planner and my laptop. No music, no wine, no emotional charge, just quiet. I laid everything out in front of me. Every major wedding expense, every deposit, every payment method, every account name. I wasn't tallying to accuse. I was mapping to understand. And what emerged wasn't just an imbalance, it was a structure. I realized that financially, the wedding didn't belong to us at all. It belonged to me. Not symbolically, not emotionally. Legally, practically, documented. The venue contract, my name. The vendors, my card. The liability, mine. The risk, entirely mine. If anything fell through, if anything went wrong, if anything needed to be disputed or absorbed, I was the one exposed. And yet socially, it was framed as our sacrifice. That discrepancy sat with me for a long time. Because this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about authorship. About who was actually building something and who was narrating it as shared. I felt a quiet stillness settle over me. Not anger, not triumph, just gravity. This is the part people often misunderstand. Discovering leverage doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels sobering. It forces you to confront how much responsibility you've accepted without safeguards. I kept going. I looked at timelines, in conversations, at moments where assumptions were made and never corrected. I realized something else too, something more unsettling. My partner genuinely believed the story he was telling. He wasn't scheming. He wasn't lying in the way people imagine villains lie. He had internalized a version of reality where my contribution was simply part of the environment, like gravity or electricity, always there, reliable, invisible. And because I had never interrupted that narrative, it solidified. The private reveal wasn't that he was malicious. It was that the system worked perfectly for him, and systems that work rarely interrogate themselves. I also noticed how often he spoke about the wedding as a milestone he was achieving, how he talked about getting through it as though the burden were emotional, not material. That distinction mattered, because emotional strain was shared, financial strain was not. The more I mapped, the clearer it became. If I continued, I would enter marriage having already set a precedent where my resources were communal, but my consent was optional. That wasn't a fear, it was a fact. And facts, once fully seen, remove your ability to pretend. There was no dramatic moment of resolve, no internal speech, just a quiet sentence that settled in my chest. I will not carry this forward, not angrily, not resentfully, simply conclusively. The reveal deepened when I began thinking beyond the wedding. I imagined future decisions, a home, children, career shifts, emergencies. I asked myself one honest question. In moments of real consequence, would I be supported, or would I be expected to absorb again? The answer wasn't comforting. I realized that love, in its current form, was not the issue. Structure was. And structure, unlike feelings, doesn't change unless it's redesigned. What made this a private reveal and not a confrontation was that nothing about my partner's behavior would have shifted if I'd spoken up then. He would have reassured me, promised improvement, expressed surprise, perhaps even guilt. But reassurance without restructuring is just emotional sedation. I wasn't looking to be soothed. I was looking to be aligned. So I didn't say anything. I let the clarity settle without sharing it. I sat with it long enough that it stopped hurting and started orienting me. This is where quiet dominance is born, not in secrecy, but in internal sovereignty. I stopped imagining conversations that would explain my feelings. I stopped rehearsing how to be understood. Understanding, I realized, was no longer my primary objective. Autonomy was. Once that shift happens, your priorities reorganize themselves without effort. I stopped asking, how do I fix this? I started asking, what outcome respects me? And that question changes everything. I also acknowledged my own role without cruelty. I didn't shame myself for staying. I didn't rewrite my past as foolish. I saw it clearly. I had chosen stability over confrontation because that's what felt safest at the time. That choice had costs, but it also gave me information. Information is leverage, not to punish, but to decide. The private reveal was this. I didn't need permission to stop. I didn't need agreement to disengage. I didn't need to be wronged loudly to leave quietly. I simply needed to stop carrying what wasn't mutually held. That realization didn't make me cold. It made me precise. And precision is powerful in ways emotion never is. From that point forward, my actions weren't fueled by hurt. They were guided by clarity. And clarity doesn't rush. It moves when everything is already in place. People imagine decision points as moments of urgency. Raised voices, ultimatums, deadlines that force your hand. But the real decision point, the one that actually alters the trajectory of your life, rarely looks like that. Mine unfolded slowly, in the quiet after clarity. Once the private reveal settled into something solid inside me, I found myself standing at an internal crossroads. Not between staying and leaving, those words were too blunt, but between continuing the pattern and ending my participation in it. There were many options available to me. I saw them clearly. I could confront him, sit him down, explain how uneven things had become, ask for fairness, ask for restructuring, ask him to step up in ways I had never required before. I could delay the wedding, frame it as stress, timing, or finances, give us space to reset without naming the deeper issue. I could proceed as planned and hope that marriage would somehow recalibrate the imbalance, hope that vows would do what boundaries hadn't. Or I could choose the option that didn't require convincing anyone of my worth, my exhaustion, or my right to be considered, the irreversible one. What made this decision point different from earlier moments wasn't resolution. It was the absence of fantasy. I wasn't imagining him suddenly understanding everything. I wasn't picturing a future version of us where things magically balanced out. I wasn't bargaining with potential. I was looking at reality as it existed and asking whether I was willing to carry it forward. That question stripped everything else away. I spent days, not agonized days, but thoughtful ones, walking through each option in my mind. Not emotionally, but structurally. If I confronted him, what would actually change? Language, perhaps, promises, apologies. But structure? That would require a fundamental shift in how he related to responsibility, and there was no evidence that shift would be self-sustaining without constant correction from me. If I delayed, what would that signal? That imbalance required my flexibility to resolve, that the cost of discomfort would again be mine to absorb. If I proceeded, what precedent would I be formalizing? That partnership meant my resources were shared, while my consent was negotiable. None of those options respected the clarity I had reached. There's a point where insight creates obligation, not to others, but to yourself. Once you see clearly, continuing as before becomes a form of self-betrayal. That's when I understood something quietly radical. I didn't owe anyone a process that required me to keep proving what was already evident. I wasn't leaving because I was angry. I wasn't leaving to punish. I wasn't leaving because I hadn't tried hard enough. I was leaving because staying would require me to abandon the version of myself that had finally come into focus. The decision, when it arrived, didn't feel dramatic. It felt clean. I remember sitting at my desk one evening, the planner open in front of me, the same one I'd been using to document everything. I looked at the notes, not with heaviness, but with finality. I realized I had reached the edge of what explanation could do. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a mismatch in how responsibility was held. And mismatches don't resolve through persuasion. They resolve through separation. The irreversible part wasn't the ending of the relationship. It was the ending of my willingness to negotiate my own boundaries internally. Once that ended, the external outcome was inevitable. I didn't rush to act immediately. Decision points aren't about speed, they're about direction. Once the direction is chosen, movement can be measured. I gave myself time to feel the weight of it. Not grief exactly, but gravity. Because choosing the irreversible option means accepting that you will never know who someone might have been under different circumstances. You grieve the hypothetical quietly, without ceremony. There were moments of doubt, not about the decision itself, but about how it would be received. I knew how this would look from the outside. People would say it was sudden. They would say it came out of nowhere. They would say it could have been fixed with a conversation. I accepted that. One of the costs of choosing yourself quietly is that others don't get a narrative they understand, and I no longer needed them to. What anchored me wasn't certainty about the future. It was certainty about the present, about what I was no longer willing to normalize. I also recognized something humbling. Choosing the irreversible option meant relinquishing the role I had mastered. The dependable one. The one who made things work. The one who absorbed. There was a strange comfort in that role, even as it depleted me. Letting it go meant stepping into ambiguity, being misunderstood, possibly judged. But I had already been misunderstood, just in a way that benefited others. This time, misunderstanding would cost me less. The final internal confirmation came when I imagined staying. Not the wedding day, not the highlight reel, but the ordinary days after. The quiet resentments, the subtle recalculations, the ongoing self-silencing is required to keep things smooth. That image felt heavier than leaving ever could. So I chose the path that aligned with who I had become, not who I had been trying to be. The decision didn't make me fearless, it made me honest. And honesty, when practiced inwardly, has a momentum of its own. Once the decision was made, I stopped weighing options. I stopped revisiting conversations. I stopped rehearsing explanations. I shifted into execution, not emotionally, but practically. Because the most irreversible decisions don't announce themselves with words. They announce themselves with action. Once the decision was made, something surprising happened. I became very calm, not relieved, not energized. Calm in the way you are when the argument inside you finally ends. When there's no more back and forth, no more inner negotiation, just direction. Moving in silence doesn't mean disappearing overnight. It means decoupling without spectacle. I didn't announce anything. I didn't hint. I didn't withdraw emotionally in a way that would raise alarms. On the surface, I was still present, engaged, responsive, cooperative. But underneath, I was methodical. The first thing I did was protect my footing. I reviewed every financial commitment I was personally tied to. I noted which ones could be paused, which ones were already sunk costs, and which ones required deliberate closure. I didn't rush to cancel anything impulsively. I wanted every action to be clean, defensible, and irreversible in the right order. Silence is most powerful when it's paired with precision. I began shifting my resources back toward myself. Not dramatically, not resentfully, just responsibly. I reduced exposure. I stopped covering costs that had never been explicitly agreed upon. When payments came due that weren't clearly mine, I waited. Not as a test, as a boundary. No one noticed at first because the system had enough momentum to coast. That's how overfunctioning works. It creates a buffer that hides imbalance until the buffer is gone. I also prepared emotionally, but not in the way people imagine. I didn't rehearse speeches or confrontations. I practiced neutrality. I asked myself, can I speak plainly without justifying? Can I tolerate being misunderstood? Can I hold my ground without explaining my entire inner world? Those questions mattered more than any legal or financial step. My partner continued as usual. He talked about plans, about timelines, about how things were almost done. His confidence never wavered because nothing had yet forced him to reconsider it. That's the strange thing about moving in silence. People often feel safest right before the ground shifts. I noticed how often he relied on my steadiness, not just logistically, but emotionally, how my calm reassured him that everything was on track. I didn't withdraw that calm, I just stopped using it to carry things that weren't mine. There were moments when I could have said something, when I could have redirected the entire trajectory with one honest sentence. But honesty at that stage would have required me to re-enter a negotiation I had already concluded internally. I wasn't avoiding conflict, I was avoiding regression. I also quietly arranged practical safeguards, making sure my personal documents were accessible, my finances clearly delineated, my options open. Nothing dramatic, nothing suspicious. Just the kind of preparation you do when you're done relying on assumptions. This wasn't secrecy for its own sake. It was respect for my own process. Because once you announce a shift too early, you invite others to interfere with it, to reinterpret it, soften it, delay it. I needed this movement to be uninterrupted. As days passed, I felt something unfamiliar. Space, mental space, emotional space, the absence of constant calculation. I wasn't bracing anymore. I wasn't preemptively solving. I wasn't adjusting myself to keep things smooth. I was simply moving forward, quietly, deliberately, in alignment with a decision that no longer required validation. No one noticed yet, and that was exactly the point. The consequences didn't arrive as a confrontation. They arrived in confusion. Small at first, almost deniable. A vendor followed up with a question that wasn't automatically answered. A payment reminder landed where it had never landed before. A decision was stalled because the person who usually absorbed the friction didn't step in. At first, everyone assumed it was a glitch. My partner mentioned it casually one evening, scrolling through his phone. "Hey, did you see this email? They're asking about the balance." I looked at it, nodded, and said calmly, "Yes, they're waiting on confirmation." "From who?" he asked. I let the silence sit for half a second longer than usual. "From the person responsible for it." He frowned, not alarmed, just momentarily disoriented. "Oh, I thought you were handling that." There it was, the assumption spoken aloud. I didn't correct him. I didn't accuse. I didn't rush to fill the gap. "I handled what we discussed," I said. "This part wasn't." The conversation drifted after that. No argument, no tension that could be named. But something had shifted. Not in volume, in orientation. For the first time, the system encountered resistance. Not because I pushed back, but because I stopped compensating. The next few days brought more moments like that. Questions without automatic answers. Tasks without invisible completion. Costs without immediate coverage. None of it was dramatic enough to demand a serious conversation. That's why it worked. My partner became slightly restless, not upset, uncertain. He double-checked details he'd never paid attention to before. He asked questions that revealed how much he'd relied on me without realizing it. "What's the status on this? Did we already take care of that? Are we okay on timing?" Each question landed differently now, because the answer wasn't reassurance, it was reality. "We need to decide. It hasn't been handled yet. We'll need to talk about that." Not confrontational, just factual. I watched something subtle unfold. The emotional ease he'd been operating from began to fray. Not because I changed my tone, but because the safety net was no longer automatic. People around us sensed it too. Friends asked gentle questions. Family members commented on how busy things seemed all of a sudden. I didn't correct their perceptions. I let ambiguity exist. There's a moment when consequences begin, not as loss, but as inconvenience. An inconvenience is often the first thing people notice when someone stops overgiving. No one accused me of anything. That's important. No one said I'd changed. No one said I was being unfair. But I could feel the recalibration happening. Others adjusting their expectations in real time, trying to locate the missing support they'd grown accustomed to. And for the first time, I didn't rush to make them comfortable. My partner, especially, seemed unsettled. Not angry, but off balance. The confidence he'd carried began to thin around the edges. He spoke less in absolutes. He checked in more often. But the check-ins weren't about me. They were about stability. That told me everything I needed to know. Because when the cost of imbalance finally becomes visible, it doesn't feel like injustice to the person who benefited. It feels like a disruption. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was simply no longer absorbing the consequences of decisions I hadn't truly shared. And that absence was loud in ways words never are. By the time the urgency set in, the ground had already shifted. That's the cruel irony of imbalance. It feels invisible while it's being maintained, and unbearable once it's removed. The first signs weren't dramatic pleas or apologies. They were questions that arrived too late, framed as concern, but rooted in disruption. "Are we okay? You seem distant. Did I miss something?" Those questions used to come paired with reassurance, from me. This time, they hung unanswered for a moment longer than expected. I didn't punish him with silence. I answered honestly, but minimally. "I've been thinking," I said. "I've been noticing things. I'm not comfortable continuing the way we have been." The word comfortable unsettled him more than any accusation would have. It implied a threshold had already been crossed. He tried to respond with logic first, with explanations, with reframing. "You know I didn't mean for it to feel that way. It was never my intention. We can fix this. Fix now. But fixing requires time. Time I had already spent understanding. As the weight of the situation began to register, his tone shifted. Not to anger, but to urgency. He started noticing details he'd never tracked before. He asked about numbers, about timelines, about what exactly I needed to feel balanced. The irony wasn't lost on me. These were conversations I would have welcomed months earlier. Before clarity turned into conclusion, I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't invalidate his concern. But I also didn't mistake it for a transformation. There's a difference between realizing someone is leaving and realizing you've been unfair. One motivates repair, the other motivates retention. And I could feel which one this was. He spoke about partnership, about learning, about doing better. He offered adjustments, partial ones, suggestions that still required me to monitor, remind, and manage. He wanted reassurance that effort would be enough, but effort wasn't the missing piece. Structure was, and structure can't be rebuilt in the same space where it collapsed, especially not under pressure. I told him the truth calmly. This isn't about one thing, I said. It's about a pattern I can't carry forward. He asked why I hadn't said something sooner. I could have listed all the times I'd tried, in small ways, in quiet hesitations, in moments that were smoothed over because they were inconvenient. Instead, I said something simpler. I did say something, I said, just not loudly. That landed harder than anything else. Regret followed, not explosive, but heavy. He replayed moments aloud, realizing in retrospect what they had meant. He apologized not defensively but earnestly, and I believed his sincerity. That was the hardest part, because sincerity doesn't rewind time. It doesn't undo the clarity that has already taken root. He asked if we could pause, slow down, get help, and reset expectations. I knew then that the window had closed, not because change was impossible, but because it would now require me to stay in a position of uncertainty, waiting to see if fairness could be learned under duress. I had already learned something else, that I didn't need to stay to be convinced. So I said the only thing that was true. I'm done. Not angrily, not dramatically, just conclusively. The panic that followed wasn't loud. It was quiet, disoriented. The kind that comes from realizing the foundation you relied on was never guaranteed. Nothing could be reversed. Not because I was unforgiving, but because I was finished negotiating my own boundaries internally. The work had already been done. When the confrontation finally happened, it didn't feel like a confrontation at all. There was no raised voice, no dramatic reveal, no long list of grievances delivered with shaking hands. If anything, it felt restrained, almost quiet to the point of being unsettling. We sat across from each other at the same table where so many decisions had been made without noticing who carried them. The familiarity of the setting stripped the moment of drama. There was nowhere for emotion to perform. He spoke first, carefully now, slower than usual. I just want to understand, he said. When did this start? I didn't correct the premise. Understanding when wouldn't change what. A while ago, I said, long enough for me to be sure. That answer frustrated him, not because it was vague, but because it didn't offer a point of negotiation. There was no single incident he could isolate, apologize for, or fix. He asked what he could do now. That was the moment I realized how differently we were experiencing this conversation. He was standing at the beginning of awareness. I was standing at the end of deliberation. This isn't about doing something now, I said. It's about what's already been done and repeated. He tried to explain his perspective, not defensively, thoughtfully. He talked about pressure, assumptions, and how he thought we were aligned. He admitted he'd leaned on me more than he realized. I let him speak. I didn't interrupt. I didn't rush him toward guilt or relief. When he finished, he waited, for reassurance, I think, for confirmation that insight would be enough. Instead, I said, I believe you. That startled him. Believing him didn't change my decision. I wasn't there to argue intent. I was there to state the outcome. I don't think you meant to put me in that position, I continued. But I also know I can't stay in it. He asked if I was angry. I shook my head. No, I said. I'm clear. Clarity unnerves people more than anger. Anger implies volatility, something that might burn out. Clarity implies finality. He asked if there was someone else, if I'd already moved on emotionally, if something specific had pushed me over the edge. No, I said each time, this is just where I am. There was a pause then, a long one, the kind that makes people realize the conversation isn't going where they hoped. He said quietly, I wish you'd fought more. That was the closest we came to the heart of it. I did, I said, just not out loud. That was the truth. And it didn't need embellishment. I didn't list sacrifices. I didn't detail spreadsheets or timelines. I didn't need him to agree with me for it to be real. The confrontation ended without resolution because resolution wasn't the goal. There was no explosion because there was no longer any pressure inside me. The work of feeling, deciding, and accepting had already been done privately. All that remained was honesty, delivered without heat, without accusation, without retreat. And that, more than anything, made it irreversible. Who I am now isn't a reaction to what happened. It's a return to something I set aside for a long time without realizing it. I'm still calm, still thoughtful, still capable. Those parts of me didn't disappear when I stopped overgiving. What changed was ownership. I no longer confuse strength with silence. I no longer equate love with endurance. I no longer believe that being easy is the same as being valued. After everything ended, there was no dramatic rebirth. No sudden confidence boost. No moment where I felt triumphant or vindicated. What I felt instead was spaciousness. Time slowed down. Decisions felt lighter. My mind was no longer occupied with managing imbalance, smoothing discomfort, or preemptively fixing things before they became inconvenient for others. That absence taught me something important: how much of myself I had been allocating to maintenance. Without that constant background effort, I began to notice who I was when I wasn't compensating. I noticed that I still liked planning, but only when it was reciprocal. I still liked supporting, but only when it wasn't assumed. I still liked partnership, but only when it felt mutual in structure, not just language. I didn't harden. I didn't retreat from intimacy. If anything, I became more precise about it. I pay attention now to how people handle responsibility when it's uncomfortable. I notice whether accountability appears only after pressure or whether it's present by default. I listen less to reassurance and more to patterns, and I trust myself when something feels off, without needing to justify that feeling immediately. The most meaningful change isn't visible from the outside. People still describe me as composed, grounded, and reliable. The difference is that now, reliability is something I offer, not something that's taken for granted. I've also made peace with being misunderstood by people who only knew me in the role I played for them. When you step out of a system that benefited others, they often interpret your clarity as coldness. I let them, not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. I don't need to be seen as kind by people who only felt comfortable when I was invisible. What I gained wasn't power over anyone else. It was sovereignty over myself. That kind of dominance is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition. It simply redraws the boundaries of what you will and won't participate in. I still believe in love. I still believe in partnership. But I no longer believe that sacrifice should be unnamed, unmeasured, or unreciprocated. Who I am now is someone who understands that clarity is not cruelty, and that choosing yourself doesn't require an audience. It only requires honesty. There's a temptation, when a story ends like this, to look for a villain, to assign blame cleanly, to simplify what happened into right and wrong, winner and loser. But real life rarely offers that kind of symmetry. What it offers instead is responsibility, not just for what others do, but for what we quietly allow to become normal. For a long time, I believed that my willingness to carry more made me loving, mature, strong. I thought that if I stayed patient, if I didn't make things difficult, fairness would eventually emerge on its own. It didn't. What I learned, slowly, uncomfortably, is that imbalance doesn't correct itself through endurance. It stabilizes. It settles in. And the longer it goes unnamed, the harder it becomes to dismantle without loss. This story isn't a warning against love or commitment. It's a reminder that partnership isn't defined by shared language, but by shared weight. By who pauses when things get heavy, and who keeps walking because someone else always adjusts. Quiet dominance isn't about control, it's about discernment. It's knowing when silence protects peace, and when it protects inequality. It's knowing the difference between generosity and self-erasure. It's recognizing that you don't need to explode to exit something that no longer honors you. I didn't leave because I stopped caring. I left because I started caring about myself, without conditions. And if there's one moral I want to leave you with, it's this: being capable does not obligate you to carry what was never mutually agreed upon. Being calm does not mean you consent. And choosing yourself quietly is not the same as giving up. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop explaining and start aligning your actions with what you already know to be true. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own life in it, I hope you hear this gently. Awareness is not a betrayal of love. It's an invitation to renegotiate it, starting with yourself. You don't need to wait for a breaking point to deserve balance. You don't need permission to stop absorbing what hurts you slowly. and you don't need to make anyone the villain to choose a different ending. Thank you for staying with this story, for listening without rushing to judgment, for allowing quiet truths the space they rarely get. I'll leave you with one question. Take your time with it, and if you're comfortable, I'd love to hear your answer in the comments. Have you ever realized, too late or just in time, that your silence was being mistaken for agreement?